The morning started just like any other Sunday for Harold and Martha Wilson. The elderly couple had been following their breakfast ritual at Joe's Diner for the past 23 years, ever since Harold retired from the post office. The small bell above the diner's door would ring at exactly 8:30 a.m., and Mary, their favorite waitress, would already have their usual table ready, the one by the window with a view of the old courthouse. That particular Sunday morning felt different somehow. The clouds hung low and heavy, threatening rain, but Martha had insisted they stick to their routine. "A little rain never hurt anybody," she'd said, adjusting her floral print raincoat. Harold couldn't say no to her. He never could, not in their 48 years of marriage. They finished their breakfast like always, Harold with his crispy bacon and wheat toast, Martha with her blueberry pancakes. They chatted with Mary about her grandson's first steps and listened to the usual Sunday morning chatter of the other regulars. Martha wrapped up her remaining half sandwich, something she'd started doing ever since they began feeding the neighborhood strays. The rain had started by the time they left, falling in a gentle drizzle that made the world look soft and blurry. Harold drove their old Buick carefully along Highway 43, going a bit slower than usual because of the wet roads. Martha hummed along to an old Johnny Cash song playing quietly on the radio, her fingers tapping gently on her knee. They were about 15 minutes from home when Martha suddenly grabbed Harold's arm. "Harold, stop the car. Look over there." Her voice carried that urgent tone he knew better than to ignore. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Harold spotted what had caught her attention, a dark shape moving slowly along the highway's shoulder. At first, he thought it might be a coyote. They'd been seeing more of those lately. But as he carefully pulled the Buick onto the shoulder, their headlights illuminated something that made both their hearts sink. It was a dog, and it was in terrible shape. The poor creature was limping badly, its fur so matted and muddy that it was impossible to tell its original color. Every few steps, it would pause, head hanging low, before forcing itself to move forward again. The rain had soaked it completely, making it look even more pitiful. "We can't just leave it," Martha said, already reaching for her door handle. Harold knew that term too. It was the same one she used when she convinced him to take in their last dog, Max, from the shelter. Max had passed away 2 years ago, and they'd both agreed they were too old to take on another pet. But right now, none of that mattered. "Wait," Harold said, putting on his hazard lights. He pulled out his phone and dialed the highway patrol. "We should make sure we're safe first." While he explained their situation to the dispatcher, Martha watched the dog through the window, her hand pressed against the glass as if she could somehow reach out and comfort it from inside the car. The dispatcher assured them a patrol car would be there in about 20 minutes, but Martha couldn't wait that long. She pulled out her half sandwich from breakfast and opened her door slowly, ignoring Harold's concerned protest. The rain immediately began spotting her glasses, but she didn't care. "It's okay, sweetheart," she called out softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of passing cars and the pattering rain. "We're here to help you." The dog froze, its head lifting slightly at the sound of her voice. Even from a distance, they could see the fear in its eyes, but there was something else too, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or recognition that help had finally arrived. Harold watched through the windshield as his wife of nearly 5 decades slowly approached the frightened animal, speaking in that gentle way she had, the same tone she used with their grandchildren when they were scared or hurt. The dog remained still, trembling either from fear or cold or both, its eyes fixed on Martha and the sandwich she held out in front of her. As Martha got closer, the true extent of the dog's condition became clear. Its leg was definitely injured, held at an awkward angle that suggested it had been hurt for some time. The matted fur was worse up close, with bits of debris tangled in it, telling a story of long days and nights spent wandering alone. The rain continued to fall around them, and cars whooshed past on the highway, sending up sprays of water. But in that moment, it felt like time had slowed down, like the whole world was holding its breath, watching this meeting between a kind-hearted woman and a broken dog on the side of Highway 43. The half sandwich in Martha's outstretched hand had started to fall apart in the rain, but she held steady, her arm trembling slightly from age and the cold. The frightened dog watched her every move, its eyes darting between her face and the offering she held. Years of handling scared animals at the local shelter before her retirement had taught Martha patience. This moment couldn't be rushed. "Look what I've got for you, sweetheart," she cooed softly, but voice barely carrying over the sound of passing trucks and rain hitting the pavement. "It's turkey and Swiss cheese. My favorite too." She took another small step forward, her sensible shoes squishing in the wet grass along the highway's shoulder. Behind her, Harold had gotten out of the car despite the rain, leaving the hazard lights blinking rhythmically. He stood by the open door, ready to help if needed, his weathered face creased with concern for both his wife and the trembling animal. The sight reminded him of their first date nearly 50 years ago, when Martha had stopped everything to help a trapped kitten in the movie theater parking lot. He'd known right then she was the one. The dog took a hesitant step toward Martha, then quickly retreated, its injured leg barely touching the ground. The poor thing was soaked to the bone, its fur hanging in heavy, muddy clumps. Each breath it took was visible in the cool morning air, coming in quick, nervous puffs. Martha slowly knelt down, ignoring the way her knees protested the movement. She placed half of the sandwich on the ground and backed away a few steps, still talking in that gentle, reassuring tone she perfected over years of handling nervous grandchildren and scared animals. "It's all yours, honey. You must be so hungry out here all alone." The dog watched her retreat, then looked at the sandwich, its nose twitching. Hunger finally won out over fear. It limped forward cautiously, every movement showing its pain and exhaustion. When it reached the sandwich, it didn't gobble it up like they expected. Instead, it delicately picked up the offering, displaying manners that seemed strangely out of place for a stray. While the dog ate, Harold called the local emergency vet clinic. The rain had plastered his gray hair to his forehead, but he barely noticed. "Yes, we're on Highway 43, about 2 miles past the Wilson Creek Bridge," he explained quietly into his phone. "The poor thing's definitely hurt." "No, we can bring it in if we can just get it into our car." Martha had already pulled out the other half of her sandwich. This time, she held it a bit closer to herself, and the dog, having decided the first half hadn't harmed it, took less time to approach. As it came nearer, Martha could see that beneath all the mud and matted fur, there were unusual markings she couldn't quite make out. The sound of approaching sirens made everyone freeze. The dog tensed, ready to bolt, but Martha quickly began humming an old lullaby she used to sing to her children. The familiar action calmed her own nerves as much as it seemed to steady the dog. The highway patrol car pulled up behind their Buick, its lights casting rotating blue patterns through the rain. Officer Chen stepped out, immediately assessing the situation with experienced eyes. He approached slowly, speaking in low tones to Harold, while keeping his distance from Martha and the dog. "I'll help redirect traffic," he offered. "Take your time with the rescue. Better to do it right than rush it." The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Martha continued her gentle coaxing, each movement slow and deliberate. The dog gradually moved closer, drawn by her gentle voice and the last bits of sandwich. Harold had opened the back door of their car and spread out his rain jacket across the seat. "You're such a good dog," Martha whispered, now close enough to see the intelligence in the animal's eyes. "Such a brave, good dog." She could see now that underneath all the mud and fear, this was no ordinary stray. There was something about the way it held itself, even injured, that spoke of training and purpose. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity in the rain, the dog was close enough for Martha to reach out slowly and touch its head. The fur was coarse with mud, but the dog leaned ever so slightly into her touch, drawing comfort from the gentle contact. Tears mixed with raindrops on Martha's cheeks. Getting the dog into the car proved to be another challenge entirely. It was clearly in pain, and they needed to be extremely careful with its injured leg. Harold approached slowly, following Martha's lead. Between the two of them, with Officer Chen standing by to help if needed, they'd managed to create a sort of lift with their arms. "Ready?" Harold asked, his voice thick with emotion. 1, 2, 3. They lifted as gently as they could, but the dog still let out a small whimper that broke their hearts. Once in the backseat, it immediately pressed itself against the far door, watching them with wary eyes. Martha didn't hesitate. She climbed right in beside it, her clothes soaked and muddy, but her face glowing with determination. Officer Chen gave them directions to the emergency vet clinic and offered to call ahead to let them know they were coming. As Harold carefully pulled back onto the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Martha was speaking softly to their rescue, her hand resting on the seat between them, waiting patiently for the dog to choose to come closer. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the car, something magical was happening. With each mile that passed, the dog seemed to relax just a fraction more, its breathing becoming slower, more regular. By the time they turned off the highway, it had inched closer to Martha, close enough that her fingertips could just brush against its damp fur. Neither Harold nor Martha knew it yet, but this rainy Sunday morning rescue was about to change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The old Buick's heater hummed steadily as Harold navigated the wet roads toward the emergency vet clinic. The windshield wipers kept their steady rhythm, sweeping away the rain that had now settled into a gentle drizzle. In the rearview mirror, he could see Martha in the backseat with their rescue, her gray hair still dripping from the rain, but her eyes bright with purpose. "The GPS says 30 minutes to the clinic," Harold said softly, trying not to startle the dog. "How's our friend doing back there?" Martha didn't answer immediately. She was watching the dog with the kind of attention she usually reserved for her prize-winning garden. The animal had gradually settled into a corner of the backseat, its body still tense, but its eyes growing heavier with each passing mile. Now that they were in better light, Martha could see things she hadn't noticed by the highway. "There's something different about this one, Harold," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Look how it sits, even with that injured leg. So dignified somehow." Harold adjusted the rearview mirror slightly to get a better look. She was right. Despite its pitiful condition, the dog held itself with an unusual bearing. Its head would snap to attention at certain sounds, passing sirens, a motorcycle's roar, a helicopter in the distance. Each time, its ears would perk up and its posture would change, as if responding to some long-ingrained training. The heat in the car had begun to dry the dog's matted fur, releasing an unpleasant smell of wet dog mixed with mud and something else, something metallic. Martha leaned in carefully, examining a patch of fur that had begun to separate as it dried. Beneath the tangles and dirt, she could make out what looked like regular patterns, too straight to be natural markings. "I think," she started, then stopped, not wanting to startle the dog with sudden movements. "I think there might be something under all this mud. Well, I'm not sure what, but it's not just dirt." Harold turned the car carefully onto the bypass, his hands steady on the wheel, despite his growing curiosity. "What do you mean, dear?" "Well, see here." Martha pointed, though Harold couldn't look while driving. "There are these straight lines, almost like it was wearing something for a long time. Something that left marks in its fur." The dog's head turned at her voice, and for a moment its eyes met Martha's. There was something in that gaze that made her breath catch, an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. The dog blinked slowly, then did something unexpected. It moved slightly closer to her, just an inch or two, but the movement was deliberate. "Oh, you're starting to trust us a little, aren't you?" Martha's voice was thick with emotion. She kept her hand still on the seat, allowing the dog to make its own choices about closeness. "We're going to get you all fixed up, sweetheart. Get that leg looked at properly." As if understanding her words, the dog's ears twitched, and it let out a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a sigh. It shifted again, and this time Martha could see something glinting deep in its fur, near its shoulder. The movement had dislodged some of the mud, revealing what looked like a tiny metal object embedded in the tangles. "Harold," she said, her voice dropping even lower, I think this might be more than just a lost pet. There's something official-looking about it. The way it responds to certain sounds, these markings in its fur." Harold met her eyes in the mirror, understanding passing between them. In their small town, they'd seen military convoys pass through often enough to recognize certain patterns of behavior. The way this dog carried itself, even injured, it reminded them of the servicemen and women they'd see at the diner, that same alert awareness of their surroundings. The rain had almost stopped now, and rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, creating patches of brightness on the highway ahead. The dog had relaxed enough to let its head rest on the seat, though its good leg remained tucked under it, ready to move if needed. Every few minutes, it would open its eyes to check its surroundings, a behavior that seemed more learned than instinctive. Martha had started humming again, an old song her mother used to sing. The dog's ears would twitch at certain notes, and gradually, ever so gradually, it began to lean slightly toward the sound. By the time they were halfway to the clinic, the gap between Martha and the dog had shrunk to just a few inches. "Look in the glove compartment, Harold," Martha said suddenly. "I think I still have those dog treats from when we used to take Max to the park." Harold reached over, keeping one hand steady on the wheel, and popped open the glove compartment. Sure enough, there was a half-empty bag of dog treats, probably a bit stale but still sealed. He handed them back to Martha, careful not to make any sudden movements. The moment Martha opened the bag, the dog's head lifted, its nostrils flaring. But instead of the eager excitement you might expect from a stray, it waited, watching Martha with that same dignified patience. She held out a treat on her palm, and the dog took it with surprising gentleness, its manners once again suggesting special training. "Harold," Martha said, her voice full of wonder, "when it took that treat just now, I swear it responded to something I didn't even say out loud. The way it waited, the way it watched my hand. This dog's had some serious training, I'm sure of it now." As they turned off the highway onto the road that would lead them to the vet clinic, Harold found himself wondering what kind of story they were about to uncover. In all their years together, all their experiences with animals, they'd never encountered anything quite like this. The GPS announced they were just 5 minutes from their destination. In the backseat, the dog had finally allowed itself to rest its head against Martha's leg, its eyes heavy but still alert. Martha's hand hovered near its head, not quite touching, respecting the space the animal still needed. "Whatever your story is," she whispered to the dog, "you're safe now. We'll figure this out together." The emergency veterinary clinic stood as a beacon of hope in the late morning light, its red and white sign glowing against the clearing sky. Harold pulled into a parking spot near the entrance, and for a moment, nobody moved. The dog had grown comfortable enough with Martha to rest its head on her lap, and she was reluctant to disturb this newfound trust. "We're here, sweetheart," Martha whispered, her hand hovering just above the dog's head. "These people are going to help you feel better." The dog's eyes opened slowly, taking in its new surroundings with that same alert intelligence they'd noticed earlier. Getting the dog out of the car proved easier than getting it in. Despite its injury, it seemed to understand they were there to help, following Martha's gentle guidance with remarkable patience. Harold held the clinic door open as Martha walked beside their rescue, her steps slow to match its limping pace. The reception area was quiet, thanks to Officer Chen's call ahead. A kind-faced woman in blue scrubs hurried out from behind the desk, clipboard in hand. "You must be the Wilsons," she said softly, taking in the scene before her. "Dr. Lee is ready for you. She's our best with trauma cases." They were led to a large examination room where a vet in a white coat waited. Dr. Lee had gentle eyes and moved with the careful precision of someone used to handling scared animals. "Hello," she greeted them warmly. "Can you tell me what you know about our patient here?" While Harold explained their highway rescue, Dr. Lee observed the dog from a distance, noting its reactions and movements. The dog, for its part, remained close to Martha, but watched the vet with an intensity that seemed almost calculating. "I'd like to do an initial examination," Dr. Lee said, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "Would you mind staying close, Mrs. Wilson? He seems to trust you." Martha nodded, moving to the examination table where Dr. Lee had patted. To everyone's surprise, the dog followed her lead, and with some help from Harold, managed to get onto the table without too much distress. As Dr. Lee began her gentle examination, something unexpected happened. She gave a command, just a simple stay, but she said it in what sounded like a foreign language. The dog's reaction was immediate and startling. Its ears snapped to attention, and despite its injuries, it instantly shifted into a rigid, trained posture. Dr. Lee stepped back, her expression changing. "I think," she started, then moved to examine the dog's shoulder more closely. Her fingers worked carefully through the matted fur, revealing what Martha had noticed earlier, those strange, regular patterns. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Lee said carefully, "when you found him, did you notice any kind of vest or harness?" Martha shook her head. "No, but I saw something strange in his fur, like marks where something might have been." Dr. Lee nodded, continuing her examination with renewed focus. She gently cleaned a small patch of fur, revealing a tiny mark that made her reach for her phone immediately. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice carrying a new urgency. "Please stay with him. There's something very special about this dog." While Dr. Lee stepped into the hallway, Harold and Martha exchanged glances. The dog remained in its alert posture, though its eyes kept tracking Martha's movements, as if seeking reassurance. "Look here," Harold said softly, pointing to where Dr. Lee had cleaned the fur. There, barely visible, was a small symbol that looked official, military official. Martha's hand found Harold's and squeezed it. The pieces were starting to come together. The dog's unusual training, its response to commands in another language, its dignified bearing despite its injuries. This wasn't just any lost dog they'd rescued from the highway. Dr. Lee returned, her face a mix of excitement and concern. "I've just gotten off the phone with someone very interested in your rescue," she said. "But first, we need to treat these injuries. That leg hasn't healed properly. It looks like an old wound that never received proper medical attention." As Dr. Lee prepared for a more thorough examination, she explained that she needed to take some x-rays and clean the dog properly to assess all its injuries. "There might be a microchip under all this matted fur," she added. "Though I have a strong suspicion I already know who this dog belongs to." Martha stayed by the dog's side as Dr. Lee worked, speaking softly to it as various tests were run. The dog's behavior continued to amaze them. It remained perfectly still for the x-rays, followed basic commands in multiple languages, and showed training responses that went far beyond typical pet obedience. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Dr. Lee stood back with the x-rays displayed on a light board. "Well," she said, "I can tell you several things for certain. This dog has had extensive professional training. The way it responds to commands, its patience during examination, these are hallmarks of specialized training. The injury to its leg is about 3 months old, and while it's begun to heal, it didn't heal correctly." She paused, looking at Harold and Martha with deep respect. "What you've done today, you've not just rescued a stray dog. You've found someone very special who's been missing for quite a while. I've made some calls, and there are people who've been searching for this dog for months." The dog had relaxed slightly, allowing Martha to stroke its head gently. Despite the revelation that it would likely have to leave them, she couldn't help but feel proud. They'd saved this remarkable animal, given it a chance to find its way home. "There's more," Dr. Lee continued, her voice gentle. "But I think it's best if we wait for some other people to arrive. They can explain everything. They're already on their way." The waiting room clock ticked steadily as Harold and Martha sat with cups of warm tea provided by the kind receptionist. Their rescue dog had been taken to a treatment room where Dr. Lee was cleaning him up and treating his immediate injuries. The rain outside had stopped completely now, leaving behind a fresh, clean smell that drifted in whenever the clinic's door opened. It had been just over an hour since Dr. Lee's mysterious phone call, and Martha kept glancing at the entrance, wondering who would walk through it. Harold held her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm, a habit of 48 years whenever she was anxious. The dog's initial examination had revealed more than just the injured leg. Once they'd cleaned small patches of fur, they'd found several identifying marks that Dr. Lee said were significant. The way the dog responded to commands in different languages had been the first clue, but it was a small tattoo in its ear that had made Dr. Lee reach for her phone with such urgency. The clinic door chimed, and 2 people walked in. They wore civilian clothes, but something about their bearing immediately reminded Martha of her nephew who served in the military, that same alert posture, that same purposeful way of moving. The taller of the 2 spoke quietly with the receptionist, who immediately directed them to where Harold and Martha sat. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," the woman said, her voice warm but professional. "I'm Lieutenant Richards, and this is Master Sergeant Cooper. We're here about the dog you rescued this morning." Martha's hand tightened around Harold's. "Is he yours?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "In a way," Lieutenant Richards replied, sitting down across from them. "The dog you found is actually Shadow, one of our most highly trained military working dogs. He disappeared during a training exercise 3 months ago, about 200 miles from here." Master Sergeant Cooper added, "We've been searching for him ever since. Shadow isn't just any military dog. He's one of our most valuable team members, specially trained in multiple disciplines. His training alone represents years of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars in specialized instruction. Dr. Lee joined them then, pulling up a chair. I finished cleaning him up, she said. Once we got through all that matted fur, his identifying marks were clear. The microchip confirms it. This is definitely Shadow. What happened to him? Harold asked, thinking of how they'd found the poor creature limping along the highway. Lieutenant Richards's face softened. We believe Shadow was spooked by an unexpected explosion during a training exercise, not unusual for the type of work we do, but this time something went wrong. He bolted, and despite our best efforts, we couldn't track him. We think he was trying to find his way back to base, but got disoriented. The injury to his leg likely happened during his escape. He's been surviving on his own all this time, Martha whispered, her heart aching for what the dog must have been through. Actually, Master Sergeant Cooper said that's what's most remarkable. Shadow's injuries show signs of basic care. We think someone must have helped him at some point, but perhaps couldn't keep him. His military training probably made him keep moving, trying to find his way home. Dr. Lee pulled out some x-rays, showing them to the military personnel. His leg was clearly broken, but someone tried to set it. It wasn't done properly, which is why it healed wrong, but someone definitely tried to help him. The real miracle, Lieutenant Richards said, looking at Harold and Martha with genuine gratitude, is that you found him. Another few weeks on that leg, and the damage might have been permanent. But thanks to you, we can properly treat it now. Our veterinary team thinks he'll make a full recovery. Martha wiped a tear from her eye. He's such a special dog. The way he took food so gently, how he responded to commands even though he was scared and hurt. That's Shadow, Master Sergeant Cooper said proudly. Even injured and lost, he remembered his training. These dogs are incredible. Their intelligence, their loyalty, their dedication to duty. They're true heroes. A technician appeared at the door then, and everyone turned to look. Behind her stood Shadow, clean, groomed, and looking like a completely different dog. His fur, now free of mud and tangles, was a rich brown color with distinctive markings. Despite the bandages on his leg, he carried himself with dignity, every inch the military working dog he was trained to be. But something unexpected happened. The moment Shadow saw Martha, his trained demeanor softened. He limped over to her, pressing his head against her knee in a gesture of pure affection. Lieutenant Richards watched this interaction with interest. That's unusual, she said slowly. Shadow is highly trained to maintain professional distance, but clearly he's formed a bond with you. He knows who saved him, Master Sergeant Cooper said softly. These dogs are incredibly intelligent. He understands that you helped him when he needed it most. Martha stroked Shadow's clean fur, marveling at the transformation. Under all the mud and matted hair had been this magnificent animal, this highly trained military working dog who had somehow found his way to them on a rainy Sunday morning. What happens now? Harold asked, his voice rough with emotion. The military personnel exchanged glances. Well, Lieutenant Richards began. Normally, after medical treatment, Shadow would return to base for rehabilitation and eventually return to active duty. However, she paused, watching as Shadow leaned against Martha's leg, his eyes half closed in contentment. We need to discuss some options. Shadow's been through a traumatic experience, and his response to you is quite remarkable. We might need to consider what's best for him long-term. Master Sergeant Cooper nodded. Sometimes, after experiencing trauma, these dogs need a different kind of care. They're like soldiers in that way. They can develop anxiety, PTSD. Shadow is showing signs of that, but he's also showing signs of healing, right here with you. Martha looked up hopefully, her hands still resting on Shadow's head. The dog that had started their Sunday as a muddy, frightened creature on the highway had turned out to be so much more than they could have imagined. And somehow, despite all his training and background, he had chosen to trust them. The afternoon sun streamed through the clinic's windows as everyone gathered in Dr. Lee's office to discuss Shadow's future. The military dog sat between Harold and Martha, his head resting against Martha's leg, while Harold gently scratched behind his ears. Despite his newly revealed identity as a highly trained military asset, Shadow seemed determined to stay close to the elderly couple who had saved him. Lieutenant Richards spread several documents on Dr. Lee's desk, her face thoughtful. We need to talk about what's best for Shadow, she began. Normally, protocol would be clear. He'd return to base for rehabilitation and eventually resume his duties. But this situation is unique. How so? Harold asked, noticing how Shadow pressed closer to Martha at the mention of returning to base. Master Sergeant Cooper stepped forward, his expression softening as he watched Shadow. Military working dogs are incredible animals, but they're also susceptible to trauma, just like human soldiers. What Shadow's been through, the accident, the injury, months of surviving alone, it leaves marks that aren't just physical. Dr. Lee nodded, pulling up Shadow's x-rays on her computer screen. The physical injuries we can heal. His leg will need surgery to re-break and set it properly, followed by rehabilitation. But it's his emotional state I'm more concerned about. What do you mean? Martha asked, her hand protectively on Shadow's head. During his examination, we noticed several stress responses, Dr. Lee explained. Loud noises make him flinch, which isn't typical for a military-trained dog. He shows anxiety in enclosed spaces, and there are other signs of post-traumatic stress. Lieutenant Richards leaned forward in her chair. This is where our decision becomes complicated. Shadow was one of our best, highly trained, incredibly skilled. The military invested years and significant resources in his training. But she paused, watching as Shadow gently nuzzled Martha's hand, seeking reassurance. But sometimes, after trauma, returning to active duty isn't the best option. Sometimes, these dogs need a different kind of life to heal properly. We've seen it before, Master Sergeant Cooper added. Like human soldiers, sometimes our dogs need to retire early. The challenge is finding the right situation for them. They're not typical pets. They need understanding, patience, and a special kind of care. Martha and Harold exchanged glances, years of unspoken communication passing between them. They'd both been thinking the same thing since learning Shadow's identity, but neither had dared voice their hopes. The way he's bonded with you is remarkable, Lieutenant Richards continued. Military dogs are trained to maintain professional distance, but Shadow's clearly formed a deep connection with both of you. In just a few hours, he's shown more trust and emotional response than we typically see in weeks of rehabilitation. Dr. Lee pulled up another set of notes on her computer. His vital signs are most stable when Mrs. Wilson is nearby. His stress indicators drop significantly in their presence. From a medical perspective, this kind of emotional connection can be crucial for recovery. Master Sergeant Cooper cleared his throat. Which brings us to a proposal we'd like to discuss. He pulled out a specific form from Lieutenant Richards's stack of papers. We have a program for retiring military working dogs who need special circumstances. It's not common, but in cases like this. Martha's grip on Harold's hand tightened. Shadow looked up at them, his intelligent eyes moving between their faces as if he understood exactly what was being discussed. Are you saying? Harold started, hardly daring to hope. Lieutenant Richards smiled. We're saying that, if you're interested, we'd like to discuss the possibility of Shadow retiring to your care. It wouldn't be simple. He'd need surgery first, then rehabilitation. You'd need training on how to handle a former military dog, how to help with his recovery, how to manage his needs. Yes, Martha said immediately, then blushed. I mean, if that's really possible. We'd do anything needed to help him. It's a big responsibility, Master Sergeant Cooper cautioned. Shadow will need regular veterinary checkups, physical therapy, possibly behavioral therapy. He might have nightmares, anxiety attacks. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment? Harold sat up straighter. After my time in the post office, I learned that the best healing happens at home, with people who care. If Shadow needs a place to heal, to be understood, he looked at Martha, who nodded encouragingly. Well, we've got plenty of love to give. Dr. Lee smiled. I should mention that my clinic is certified to work with military animals. If Shadow stays here, he'd have access to all the medical care he needs. We could oversee his rehabilitation right here. Lieutenant Richards began organizing the papers. There would be requirements, she explained. Regular check-ins with our veterinary team, updates on his progress, specific protocols to follow. And you'd need to understand that Shadow might never be the typical pet. His training, his experiences, they're part of who he is. We don't want a typical pet, Martha said softly, scratching Shadow's ears. We want him just as he is. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the floor, and for the first time since they'd found him, he made a sound that might have been a contented sigh. "There's something else you should know," Master Surgeon Cooper added. "The bond you formed with him, it's not just good for Shadow. Military dogs who retired to civilian life often help their new families as much as their families help them. They have an incredible capacity for love and protection once they learn to trust again." Dr. Lee started pulling out forms. "If everyone's in agreement, we can start the process today. Shadow's surgery would be scheduled for next week, after he's had some time to rest and build up his strength. During his recovery, we can begin the training sessions for you both." Martha and Harold looked at each other, then at Shadow, who was watching them with those intelligent eyes. They thought about their quiet house, their empty days since retiring, the space in their hearts that had never quite healed after losing their last dog. "Well, Shadow," Harold said softly, "what do you think? Would you like to come home with us?" As if in answer, Shadow stood carefully, mindful of his injured leg, and moved to press himself between Harold and Martha's chairs, his body relaxing completely for the first time since they'd found him on that rainy highway. 6 months had passed since that rainy Sunday morning when Harold and Martha Wilson found a broken dog on Highway 43. The seasons had changed, summer flowers had given way to autumn leaves, and Shadow had become an irreplaceable part of their family. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Joe's Diner as the Wilsons settled into their usual Sunday breakfast routine. Only now, their regular table had an extra guest, a handsome brown dog with alert eyes and a special vest marking him as a retired military service dog. Shadow lay perfectly positioned under the table, his newly healed legs stretched out comfortably. "Your usual orders?" Mary, the waitress, asked with a smile, already knowing the answer. She pulled out a dog biscuit from her apron pocket, a special treatment approved by Shadow's veterinary team. Shadow waited for Martha's gentle nod before taking the treat with his characteristic gentleness. "He's looking so good," Mary commented, watching Shadow's polite manners. "Hard to believe he's the same dog you found on the highway." Indeed, Shadow's transformation had been remarkable. After his surgery and weeks of rehabilitation, his leg had healed properly. The physical therapy sessions, which both Harold and Martha had faithfully attended 3 times a week, had restored his strength and mobility. But it was the emotional healing that had been most beautiful to watch. The nightmares that had plagued Shadow in the early days had gradually become less frequent. The military trainers who visited monthly to check on his progress had been amazed by his recovery. "It's the love," one trainer had said simply. "Sometimes that's the best medicine." Harold sipped his coffee, watching as Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of a passing motorcycle. While some loud noises still made him anxious, he had learned to look to Martha or Harold for reassurance instead of panic. The training sessions had helped them all understand each other better, teaching the Wilsons to recognize Shadow's signals and helping Shadow adjust to civilian life. "Remember how nervous we were that first night bringing him home?" Martha said softly, reaching down to stroke Shadow's head. The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes half closing in contentment. That first night had been challenging. Shadow had been anxious in the new environment, checking every room multiple times, unable to settle. But Martha had sat with him in the living room, speaking softly and knitting while Harold read aloud from his favorite book. Gradually, Shadow had relaxed enough to rest his head on Martha's foot. Each day after that had brought small victories. The first time Shadow fell asleep deeply enough to dream without nightmares. The morning he brought Harold his slippers without being asked. The afternoon he gently herded Martha away from a patch of ice on their daily walk. Every moment showed them more clearly that they hadn't just rescued a dog, they'd found a new purpose. "Here comes your breakfast," Harold said as Mary returned with their plates. Shadow's nose twitched at the smell of bacon, but he remained perfectly positioned, showing the discipline of his training combined with the contentment of knowing he was home. Martha slipped a small piece of bacon under the table, an approved Sunday treat. "You know," she said, watching Shadow's gentle acceptance of the offering, "I never thought we'd be doing this again at our age. Having a dog, learning new things, going to training sessions. And now look at us," Harold chuckled. "We know commands in 3 languages, we can recognize signs of anxiety in dogs, and our grandkids think we're the coolest grandparents ever because we have a retired military hero living with us." Shadow's training had become a source of amazement for their family. Their grandchildren loved visiting and watching Shadow respond to commands in different languages. But more than his training, it was Shadow's gentle nature that had won everyone's hearts. He seemed to know exactly who needed extra attention, lying quietly beside anyone who felt sad, or gently playing with the younger children. The military personnel who checked on Shadow regularly had started using him as an example in their retired dog program. It's not just about finding a home, Lieutenant Richards had explained during her last visit. It's about finding the right match. Shadow needed exactly what you both had to give: patience, understanding, and unwavering love. As they finished their breakfast, Martha gathered her usual half sandwich to take home, now a treat for later rather than an offering to a scared, lost dog. Shadow rose smoothly to his feet, ready for their traditional Sunday walk in the park. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clear. Other regulars at the diner waved as the Wilsons set off with Shadow walking perfectly beside them. Children often pointed at his special vest, and their parents would explain in hushed tones about his military service. "You know what I love most?" Martha said as they walked. Shadow's pace matched perfectly to their slower steps. "He still checks on us like he did that first day, always making sure we're both in sight, keeping us together." Harold nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Shadow had taken his military training and adapted it to his new mission, protecting and loving this elderly couple who had saved him on a rainy highway. He used his skills not for war anymore, but for peace, keeping Martha from slipping on wet leaves, accompanying Harold on his evening walks, providing a sense of security and companionship they hadn't even known they were missing. As they reached their favorite bench in the park, Shadow settled between them, his head resting lightly on Martha's knee while his body leaned against Harold's legs. Above them, leaves danced in the autumn breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. Who rescued who? Harold mused, sharing a smile with Martha over Shadow's head. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the ground, his eyes moving between his two humans with that same intelligence that had caught Martha's attention on the highway that rainy morning. He had gone from a broken, lost soul to a beloved family member, from a military working dog to a gentle companion, proving that sometimes the biggest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but on quiet Sunday mornings when people choose to stop and help.